State of the Industry podcast. And here we go. This episode is brought to you by KP Movement Education, your source for health and movement education and coaching. Whether you are a health or fitness professional, a fitness consumer, or perhaps a passive bystander, KP believes that everyone deserves the right to pain-free movement. That's why their memberships and services are designed to educate, empower, and inspire you to create a culture of movement for yourself and those around you. With 2 membership options, you will find education surrounding developing at-home training programs for yourself or for others, mental health and exercise, lifestyle medicine, and much, much more. Check it out at kineticperformance.ca/memberships. That's kineticperformance.ca/memberships. Hey, Fit Fam, welcome back to the State of the Industry podcast. I am your host, Jenn Jongsma. In this week's episode, I bring on a very special guest, somebody near and dear to my heart, Jennifer Jongsma. Yes, my wife makes an appearance on the podcast. It took a little bit of convincing, but we finally got her here. And she is an early childhood educator who specializes in inquiry-based learning. And we take the time to maybe take a step away from the one-on-one training that we often do and often discuss on the podcast. And instead we talk about child development and specifically the benefits of outdoor exploration and risky play when it comes to the development of children, both in the motor development realm as well as socially, mentally, and emotionally. And so there's a lot of really great information here, whether you work with children or you have children of your own, or perhaps you have family members or friends with young children. It just lends a great foundation for how to speak to them, what risk is, and how allowing certain amounts of risk is actually beneficial to development, as well as just helping them to really see how your modeling of an active, healthy lifestyle really rubs off on them later on down the road. I find that when you look at a lot of individuals coming into the gym or coming into the training center or the studio, oftentimes they're trying to really catch up to what they used to have or trying to regain what they used to have when they were young. And if we really work with young people to improve their motor development and maintain the skills that we get or we have when we are young, you'll see a much better result later on down the road. Much less pain, much less chronic disease, and just better movement overall. We really hope that you enjoy this episode. If you haven't yet, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and comment on the podcast, and we'll see you on the other side. All right, welcome, Jen, to the State of the Industry podcast. How you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. So just before we get into what we're going to be talking about today, can you just give the audience a little bit of a background about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I'm Jen. I am a teacher. I teach in Ontario, and I have been teaching for the past 10 years in early childhood education. So most of my time has been spent teaching kindergarten and in the primary grades. I've taught K to 5, but most of my time has been spent in kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2.
Nice. And so within that, what do you focus on when you're teaching? Like what would you say your teaching style is?
So I have found such a cool focus in play-based learning and inquiry-based learning. So what that is focusing on wonder, curiosity, hands-on experiences for kids to learn curriculum through more open-ended activities and opportunities. So in kindergarten, the curriculum in Ontario is actually really wonderfully created around play-based learning. So that was a really cool learning. As soon as I got into kindergarten and saw that, I was hooked. So now I'm working on bringing that inquiry and play-based learning up into the higher primary grades, so into grade 1 and grade 2, and trying to use a more curriculum focused grade, but still using play and inquiry to teach, because they're still kids, they're still young, and play is still so important for them.
Yeah. So what's the benefit of something like inquiry-based learning versus what you would typically see in a classroom?
So when we grew up, I would say, if you're in your 30s, 40s, or older, typical school for us was you sat in rows or you sat singly in a desk. The teacher stood at the front and they were the knowledge holder. So they were the one that gave everyone the knowledge, and we would just sit and listen and absorb that information. So that was kind of a traditional model. So an inquiry program actually doesn't see the teacher as the knowledge holder, but as a partner in education. So the students and the teacher are co-learners and work together towards getting knowledge. So yes, the teacher does have the curriculum in front of them and knows where they want to go, but they can use guiding questions, guiding activities to get the students to kind of discover the curriculum instead of just listening and absorbing that. So the value of an inquiry-based program is that students are taking ownership over their learning. They're much more engaged in learning because there's choice. And it's something that can be done not just in the early years, but all the way up through the grades. It would just look different based on the age and the curriculum.
Yeah. And where does something like movement fall when you're thinking about inquiry-based learning in a classroom?
I think that movement is so important. So especially teaching kindergarten, grade 1, 2s, they are very, very active. So expecting them to, sit at a desk and do their work is not going to happen. There's times that it will, but allowing students the opportunity to move throughout the day so important, because that's, movement is what solidifies knowledge, is what allows their bodies and their brains to work in tandem. So if they're moving, often their brains are actually absorbing information a lot more. So in my classroom, we use clipboards, we use flexible seating, so kids can move around the classroom and work wherever works best for them. So movement breaks are something that's scheduled into everyone's day. In York Region specifically, we have something called DPA, which is daily physical activity, which is interwoven throughout the day on top of the regular traditional physical education classes. But having the opportunity for kids to be moving throughout the day, going outside, doing outdoor learning, I found is such a rich asset to a program.
Yeah. I know when you look developmentally at the process that the body goes through from birth up until, the later child years, you see that the movement is very, very limited in the first little bit, and as the body starts to develop, they still have not gotten to the point where they are really speaking. You don't see language tied into that yet, but the instant that a child starts to walk, you see the language skills start to go as well, right? And so you see that kind of tied in development. And then even like anecdotally, if you have a very, very important phone call that you need to either make or a very important conversation, oftentimes you won't just sit at a desk while you have that conversation. You'll actually pace back and forth. You'll stand up, you'll walk around, you may go for a walk outside.
Mm-hmm.
I know for myself, when I present at conferences, I'm a mover, right? Like I move a lot when I teach. I can't just stand behind a podium and speak to somebody. I have to be moving. And I think when you think about the development of language, the development of learning, as soon as you get on your feet, yes, it opens doors for you to be able to move around and explore more of your environment, but that movement also ties directly in with the learning side. So I like that you said that, or you linked those two together. That's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to get into a little bit about children today, and like I know from my experiences in the strength and conditioning realm and the rehabilitation realm. Like I see young people, not kindergarten age. I think the youngest that we typically train is maybe 9 years old, is maybe the youngest that I've seen when we're doing actually like structured activities. But definitely in kind of the early teen years, I've seen a lot of motor control issues. I've seen a lot of poor posture, and a lot of these things are lifestyle related. They're movement related or lack of movement related. We see a huge increase in the number of children with obesity. And I just want to kind of get your perspective on kind of what's going on. What have you seen? Because you've been teaching for about 10 years, and you've seen kind of a wide range of children go through, so people who you maybe taught when they were in grade 1 or, grade 11 now kind of thing, right? Like, so you've seen them progress through. So what have you seen over the past 10 years in your teaching with regards to just what you've seen, like what have you seen in children?
Yeah. I mean, we see a lot of really wonderful things, and we see a lot of other things that are posing as problems for kids as they're working their way through school specifically. We have a lot more students identified with something. So that being a diagnosis from a psychologist or from a family doctor. So attention deficit disorder, hyperactivity disorder, autism, behavioral issues. So looking at oppositional defiance disorder. There's a lot of children in a classroom, especially in public school, who are working off of an IEP, so an individual education plan. So what that is it creates a program for students who find a traditional curriculum just a little bit too overwhelming. So it comes up with strategies to make things more manageable for them. So almost every class, I would say, has multiple students on individual education plans. There's a lot of children dealing with anxiety, and we can see that as early as kindergarten, junior kindergarten. Kids are suffering from social anxiety, from work anxiety. We're seeing, just a lot of social challenges. I guess that kind of falls into the autism piece as well, but a lot of social issues and challenges for kids with making and keeping friends. But yeah, so just there's a lot of stuff where kids are struggling with motor development skills. So fine motor, especially we find in the younger ages, fine motor skills. So those small movements like writing and coloring, things like that. Gross motor skills, we're also seeing some gait issues. So kids are walking, having difficulty moving, walking. And we see such a range of that in through the kids, but we've seen a lot of gross motor. So kids will be moving around a classroom and have difficulty navigating around desks and chairs, and often we'll bump into chairs or bump into desks that have been there all day, or run into trees outside. Like the tree's been there for months, it hasn't moved. But we're just seeing kind of some inconsistency with that. And I've found over the past, 10 years that I've been teaching, I've seen an increase in children who have some difficulties with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember a story you mentioned about just having a child trying to get them to kick a soccer ball, and no matter how hard they tried, their foot-eye coordination just was not there. And like something the size of a soccer ball, right? Like it's not, trying to catch like a small baseball. Mm-hmm. It's trying to kick something that's relatively large, and just the difficulty in doing something like that.
Yeah, and we've even had students who were, this is in kindergarten, sitting on a chair at a desk working, and then all of a sudden they were on the floor. So this ability to stabilize their body, to stay sitting on a chair, or, to move while sitting on a chair without falling off, is becoming, some kids have a major issue with that, and that ability isn't there.
Yeah. And I think that so you mentioned spatial awareness of walking into or running into things, kinesthetic awareness, so the awareness of where your body is in space when you're sitting on a chair, coordination, motor control issues. Now, I know we were talking kind of off air a little bit about some of the top reasons why that is happening, specifically because this is for trainers or teachers, parents that we're really doing this episode for. And you pointed out three that I really want to kind of dive into a little bit. One was risky play, so just a lack of risky play, and so we'll get into what play is, when this definition of risky play came about. But also just lack of outdoor activity and exploration, and then screen time as well being a big issue, and all kind of intertwining and overlapping a little bit. So I just wanted to start, before we get into actually speaking about risky play, can you just talk about where did this idea of risky play come from, right? Like, when did this all start that play is risky?
Yeah, so it's interesting. If you think about play 30 years ago to play now, it's still very similar, right? Like, play is play. But the term risky play hasn't actually showed up in research previous to, I think it's 2009, I believe, was when it was first introduced as a term into, the academia world. And that's because the play has started to shift, and the idea of risk in play became something that was becoming super uncommon. And so researchers have found that they needed to distinguish this change in their research. And so the term risky play was kind of coined by a researcher in Norway around 2009 is when we started to see research specifically into that idea of risky play.
Yeah. And so what is when you look at today's society, what is the perception of risk in general, and why did we end up having to get this term of risky play?
Yeah, so I think our society now is very risk averse. We want to avoid risk. We see risk as negative and something that we should not be involved in. And so especially I find parents are very cautious in protecting and preventing any risk for their children. And so as a society, we are doing everything that we can to reduce and remove all risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then how does that differ? Because when you look at a family, if you look at a family who has a young child, and let's just call this child 3 years old, 2 years old, the parent is always the one trying to protect the child. And is that because the child doesn't know what risk is, or is that because there's a big difference between how the child sees risk and how the parent sees risk?
Yeah, that's a big question. So I think every human sees risk and evaluates risk in different ways. And risk actually isn't always bad. So risk, you can see risk in two ways. You can see risk as being a good, healthy thing that can have positive outcomes, or risk as a negative thing. And so most of our society focuses on risk as being this negative thing that we need to eliminate. But children are actually given the skills to navigate risk themselves without adult intervention. And so if, this child's age 2 or 3 is engaging outside, they're playing, and the parent is constantly, be careful, don't do that, don't go there, don't do this, don't go that, don't do that. What that message is telling that child is that they don't make decisions on their own, that they need to rely on someone else to tell them what to do and what not to do. So what that is actually doing is it's removing the child's ability to problem solve in situations, to be able to then navigate situations independently. So children actually have, pretty good risk assessment internally. They typically know what is good for them in risk and what that they want to avoid. And so a lot of times what a parent might, or a teacher might see as being too risky for a child, the child might not actually think that it's that risky for them. And they might be able to push that boundary a little bit more and feel more comfortable with that. So children are quite good. And through my, years of watching children play and move around outside specifically, I've seen that kids are quite good at stopping themselves when they see what they're doing is a little bit too much and kind of pulling back. So specifically in like climbing trees, the kids you'll see a kid who's super confident, will run up to the top, climb all the way up. They're really high, look at me, I'm so high. And they feel this pride in the fact that they've managed to get themselves up there and that they are in fact quite high. And then they can climb back down and off they go. But you might have another child who's like, oh, I want to do that. And then they'll climb up, they get maybe halfway, and then they're like, nah, I can't go that way. That's too much risk for me. And so then they'll come down. So what's really cool is you get to watch those kids navigate those situations themselves. And as an educator watching, I'm there to make sure that what they're doing isn't dangerous, but allowing them to kind of navigate those situations. Because if I had told that first child, don't go, that's too high, for them, it wasn't too high. For me, maybe it was as the adult, but for the kid, it wasn't. And look at the joy and the accomplishment that they felt from getting to the top. So allowing kids kind of the ability to navigate some of those situations, making sure that they're not in immediate danger, but making sure that they have the ability to navigate those situations themselves. Because then you think, if they were out playing on their own, there wasn't an adult around. You don't want the kid waiting for an adult to tell them to do something or not. You want them to be able to navigate situations independently without adults around to make sure that they're making smart and safe choices when those adults aren't there guiding and monitoring.
Yeah. Because evaluating risk is part of everyday life for everybody. Right? Like whether you are a 2 to 3 year old, whether you're in kindergarten, whether you're in high school, or whether you're an adult, like it's every single second of every day, you're constantly evaluating risk. And I always like to say, like, your body, like the human body is really looking for one thing, and that's survival, right? So survival through reproduction, survival through food, survival through protecting itself, healing itself, shutting itself down when it feels like it's injured and needs to repair itself when you've pushed it too far. And I think this is the same thing. So I think this goes back to the concept that you mentioned about the innate ability of a child to evaluate risk on their own without really requiring a parent to do that for them. Right? So they're able to sense the danger, know, and then ask for help if they're in that situation, right? Because I think we discussed, the concept of danger versus risk, and most people, most parents today are trying to make like basically play as safe as possible as opposed to what it should be, which is as safe as necessary, right? So trying to avoid danger, like immediate danger. And we use the example of, a child running towards a street, right? Like like the road that you live on. And they're running towards the curb. Most parents would instantly say, stop, 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 don't run onto the road, or you run and grab them, right? But as the parent being able to pull back for a second, evaluate the situation, like are there any cars coming on the road? Right? So is there immediate danger? And then if there's not, how can you better maybe word that? And I think we'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about how to reframe risk and how to do all of that. But yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's so many situations that parents need to navigate, and that the line between risk and danger sometimes can be a very short little space. And, if we're thinking about a playground, or we're thinking outdoor learning, as a parent of younger children, your job would be to scan the space and make sure that there is nothing dangerous there. So discarded needles or whatever at a park, or broken glass bottles as your kids are running around barefoot, like those things are 100% danger. And that's something as an adult, that's something that you need to step in and manage. Things that might be risky are definitely like heights, but say that there's a rose bush or another bush that's got thorns on it. That's something that's risky, and it's not dangerous, it's risky. And so there's opportunity, you could just leave it and your kid could find out hard way by falling into it. Or, there's teaching there, oh, I noticed this, this bush has some really sharp thorns on it. You don't have to say, don't go there, stay away from that, be careful there, just give them the knowledge of like, oh, that's something that's sharp. Kids are going to logically figure out that I don't want to be playing near something that could hurt me, right? Like that's where that innate sense of risk comes in. But as the adult, as an educator, as a parent, or as a, just someone who's minding children, that, you want to give them the knowledge that they need to stay safe, but then allow them to make those decisions. So giving them the knowledge of, oh, I noticed that, there's a pointy something there. There's pointy sticks on the ground over there. Just giving them the knowledge to see those things, but not telling them what to do with that. You're just giving them the information.
Yeah. And I think that like this whole conversation about risky play ties directly into what I want to talk about next, which is just the lack of outdoor activity, the lack of exploration in today's society. And you mentioned it about like talking about play radius, looking for houses. You see this all the time in the yards that are there, and you see just kind of what's really important, I guess. So can you just talk a little bit about just how this lack of activity and outdoor exploration could be affecting movement, motor learning, child development?
Yeah, I think it's been over the past 40 years, the opportunities for outdoor play have changed drastically. Not only in just what families are comfortable with, but what our society is actually creating opportunities for. The new houses that they're building these days just break my heart, right? So many of them don't have yards. They don't have backyards. They don't have opportunities for kids to play outside. And the green space is just a field with, metal climbing equipment. And it's just completely reducing the opportunity for kids to be independent and to be outside. You'd mentioned the idea of play radius. And so research was done out in Europe about this family. They looked at different generations of the family, and the great-grandfather had a really large play radius. So what that means is from his house, he had, say, like 6 miles worth of space that he could go on his bike and bike out to places that he would go independently at a young age. And then the grandfather had a bit of a smaller radius. The parent had a even smaller, and then the child now, their radius is their house. Then a lot of times now kids can't even go out into their own backyards on their own, just out of fear of, getting neighbors judging them for, not supervising their children while they're outside, or fear of something might happen, or fear of, kidnapping. There's this idea that, people take kids all the time. So there's a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety in allowing children to be independent outside. Whereas I know, like, when we were children, like, we could take our bikes and we could bike off, and, as long as we were back by the time, those lights came on outside, we were fine. And our parents, we didn't have cell phones. They didn't know where we were. They had a general idea. But they had taught us strategies on how to navigate our neighborhood, how to make sure that we didn't get lost when we were out there. And outdoor play provides so many cool learning opportunities for kids. And the idea of risky play and outdoor play are quite linked together, I believe. And kids' development of motor skills and problem solving skills and even social skills when they're outside and independent are drastic. There's so many opportunities for learning. Risky play can kind of be divided up into like 6 different types of play. So there's playing with speeds. So that could be like with biking as fast as you can down the hill, or running as fast as you can in a park. So you have speeds. We have playing at a height. So that's like climbing trees, climbing, play equipment. There is rough and tumble play. So allowing kids to, play fight. We have another one is playing with elements. So playing with fire or water, not necessarily playing with fire, but, playing near to fire, or playing near water, or playing by a pond or a creek. Like I know there was one by my house and we used to play all the time down by the water. So that's 4. And then there is the playing with the fear of getting lost, the opportunity of getting lost. And so that looks different for different ages. For little kids, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, that's just hiding, playing hide and go seek. There's that fear of, getting lost. Whereas older kids, it's navigating the neighborhood on their own and moving around. And the other one, the last kind of area is playing with tools. So providing real tools for kids to play with. So if you're outside, maybe they have a hammer and some nails and some wood, and they're, kids can be building and kids can be creating. So all of those situations have inherent risk in them just by what they are. But the risk definitely, the danger outweighs the positives that can come from those opportunities. So kids are playing at heights. Kids who are, playing at speeds are gaining incredible motor skills. Rolling down a hill, right? Like there's so much happening with your vestibular systems that, are rolling around. It's allowing your body to build strength, to build all of those connections and things in your body and your brain as you're moving in different ways. So outdoor play is so wonderful because kids move in so many different ways. They're crawling, they're climbing, they're jumping, they're running, they're spinning, they're rolling. Whereas if you're looking at indoor play, yes, you can do some of those movements, but they're much more limited in that if you're rolling in your house, you're rolling in a flat surface, you're rolling in one direction. So outdoors, you're rolling down a hill. You're maybe trying to roll up a hill. You're learning what those types of movements can do in your body. You're learning what you're capable of. They're learning cause and effect. There's just so much learning about the world around them, about what they're capable of. And the outdoors provides this really genuine opportunity for all of this exploration. And then too, not even just the actual general calming sense that outdoors and nature have on a child's mental health as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know we had a fella named Perry Nicholson on the podcast not too long ago, and he was talking all about lymphatics. And one of the things that we discussed, I'm not sure whether it was in the podcast or it might have been just off air a little bit, but we talked about kind of the microbiome within your own body and the benefits of playing in dirt, playing in sand, playing in trees and leaves, and not having this incessant need to wash your hands all the time, but like when you bring in the bacteria and that from those, and not eating it, but just like even smelling your hands after they've been in dirt or something like that, actually brings in and helps improve the internal microbiome. So your body's ability to, break down different nutrients and absorb nutrients, and it's a really good healthy way. And so specifically during development, can be very, very beneficial for them. I know, like I was lucky enough to grow up with a forest behind my house, so we didn't have neighbors behind us. And so when you're going through that list of those six things, I was thinking to myself, I'm like, man, like we would go out back, we would climb trees to build tree forts with tools. And so we're doing so many different things in that risky play just by doing one thing. So like it's a combination of those. I played sports, so I was always running fast, skating fast, biking fast. But it's interesting, like thinking back to your children no limits. I remember this one time my older brother and one of his friends were rollerblading down the hill at our house, and the hill at our house when we were growing up was super steep, and it basically came to a dead end where there was another street going straight across that did not have a stop sign. So you had to stop, or you're going to get hit by a car. And I remember this one time they were going down, and they were going really fast, and I was going down as well. And at the bottom, there's kind of like this open green space on the one side. And so they were older than me. And so they basically just, with the rollerblades, hopped off and kind of like ran on the grass as they slowed themselves down. I ended up skidding to a stop on my stomach because I didn't have that ability. But I'm like, I'm going too fast. I'm going too fast. So I sensed the danger. I knew that I had to do it, but I couldn't do what they did. So I ended up getting hurt, but there was no lasting, effect from that, right? So And I think this is one thing that parents often maybe don't do all that well, is looking back at what they've learned and how they've learned it. And then they are like, well, I don't want them to learn it that hard way. I want them to learn it a different way. Right. And for some things that may be beneficial, but for a lot of these things with regards to playing at heights, like I've fallen out of trees and broken my arm before. I'm not going to stop my child from climbing trees. I still climb trees. Right. I'm one of those weird guys that you'd see in a park climbing a tree. Right.
He's telling the truth.
Yeah. And, I was cutting down some dead branches out of a tree at my parents' place, and they're like, oh, this doesn't quite reach. So I'm like, well, boost me up. I'll climb up this tree. So I climbed into the tree, and, I'm probably a story up, 2 stories up in the tree, and I'm, cutting down twigs. So you can still do, but the same thing. Like my parents are still like, well, are you sure, Adam? Are you okay? Like they're still, my parents, me being in my mid-30s, my parents are still checking in on me to make sure that I know what's too high, or like if I'm comfortable.
And I think that that's something that as a parent you'll always do, and you always want to make sure that your children are safe and that they're not going to get hurt, right? That's what a parent's job is to protect their child. And so there's ways to do it in a way that keeps you as the parent, I think, calm and like cool and collected, but also gives children the space to make some of those mistakes. And, your story about going down that hill, like I bet you probably didn't do that again until you were more confident in your skating skills that you could actually stop yourself from bailing onto your stomach and hurting yourself, right? Like it takes one little thing for a kid to learn. And sometimes it's a scraped knee, and sometimes it's maybe a broken bone. But if you look at the research in this area, most of, if not all of the research talks about injury and injury prevention, and that actually unstructured child-directed play, which is spontaneous and authentic, there's less injury than a more directed, adult-directed activity. So looking at maybe a sport or something like that. But children tend to do a great job when their play is independent and undirected by adults to keep themselves safe.
Yeah.
And the research speaks to that, and kind of verifies that that's not just, something that we're, as a promoting risky play, I'm not just saying that. The research actually, backs that up as well.
Yeah. So I want to just touch on the last piece here. So we've talked about risky play. We've talked about a lack of outdoor activity and exploration. And I wanted just to talk quickly about screen time, because I know this is one of the things that when we were growing up, there weren't really many screens. This is just, I don't want to date myself too much, but this is kind of when video games were first coming out. I had a Sega, like the first Sega, like the first year Sega ever came out. And so I've seen kind of the progress through, and I know that. I didn't have an Atari or anything like that because I was a bit older or a bit younger than that. But it's just this idea that screens are everywhere now. And, we see technology as being this advancement, this beneficial thing. And I know you'll touch on this, that there are benefits to having technology. There's a time and a place to use technology. But what is going on in most families that you have seen? I'm going to talk about college a little bit later, but what have you seen with regards to young children and how they're using their screen time?
Yeah, everyone's using it. I think that that's safe to assume. And it's something that is still, I think, being kind of figured out, because it is, like you say, it's relatively new. Kids are getting devices younger and younger and younger. And it's a lot of the time, I'm having a lot of conversations with parents as an educator about screen time and about, the link between that and some of the behaviors we might be seeing in classrooms. So some of the children who have a more difficult time adjusting to classroom expectations, or just, just the expectations in a classroom setting. Some of those kids, you have conversations and they're spending 5 to 6 hours on a screen at home. And, I understand a lot of the time why that needs to happen. Parents are busy. They've had long days at work. They need to make dinner and, et cetera, et cetera. And it's the quickest and easiest way to focus a child. It's always, I always find it so amazing. You put on something in the classroom and they're, everyone's instantly like mesmerized. I mean, you can see it in infants, right? Like, one of my friends we were watching something and her infant woke up. We brought him into the room and, he was laying away from the screen, but it was just doing, he's like 2 months, 3 months old and doing whatever he can to get his head to turn towards a screen. So it's something that from birth, kids are drawn towards screens. I know as adults, we're the same. We're constantly checking our phones. We're constantly, watching Netflix, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that there's definitely a time and a place, and there's a lot of really wonderful educational shows and apps and programs available for kids. But I think the biggest kind of learning would be just to learn how to limit it and to use it in minimal ways, but also in smart ways. So just having 5 to 6 hours of open screen time on an iPad in an evening is probably not a healthy use of screen time. And so just being a little more intentional with screen time, I think, can allow children to actually develop better and to develop in a way that is a little bit more well-rounded, I guess, in that they are sitting in their home. They're not constantly on a screen and using that as a way to entertain them, but they're maybe sitting and are feeling a little bit bored and have to come up with, creativity and come up with an idea to keep themselves entertained. And I know with conversations with parents and my own experience, you always kind of feel like as the adult, like we need to be keeping these kids busy. We need to make sure that they are doing things and are engaged and are focused on whatever task it might be. But there's something to be said about boredom, and there's a lot of really cool things that can come out of boredom. Like I look back on my childhood, and I have a brother, and a lot of the times the two of us would just, their adults are over and we had to keep ourselves entertained. And our parents never set up structured activities for us to do. It was always just, you have your toys, you have your things, figure it out. And so we created so many cool games and activities and things because we were able to kind of sit with that boredom and figure out what it was we wanted to do to be entertained. And so free play away from a screen builds creativity, builds problem solving skills. And then when you throw that play outside, then it's even better.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there's definitely a time and a place for screen time for sure. I think it's just being intentional with it. What are you using it for? What's the purpose for why we're using it? And being intentional on timing with that. I know there's so many, researchers out there and just talking about, the tech basket, right? Like, we have our time with our tech, but then everyone, parents included, tech goes into a basket, and this is our non-tech time. This is family time without technology. And so being intentional about modeling what that looks like, limiting screen time, modeling, family time without technology, and then modeling healthy use of screen time, because it is something that I think everyone needs to learn. It's something that I'm still learning myself. And especially with COVID and the shutdown and the school online, like that changed everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think everyone's still kind of navigating and learning what that looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like I look back just like you did to my childhood, and it was my dad worked quite a bit, longer hours. My mom at that time when I was younger was stay-at-home mom, and so she was constantly busy when we came home from school or anything like that. She was cooking, she was cleaning, she was doing something. And so you couldn't bother her, you couldn't bother my dad because he probably wasn't home yet at that point. And so we would probably play outside. So we'd be running around either in our backyard or out front of our house, down the street. My parents, all they had to do was stick their head out the door, yell, all our kids' names, and then we'd all come running. But yeah, it's basically like you go and figure out something to do. I don't care what you do, just go and figure out something to do.
Mm-hmm.
And as I got a little bit older, every now and then it was me getting into a bit of trouble. But yeah, I just think like for us, we had to find other ways to get around it. And I think it's harder now to be a parent with regards to the availability of technology, but also uh, the social pressure that kids have to have technology as well of their own. So to have a cell phone, like I didn't get my first cell phone until I was in first year university. And now there's a wait till grade 8, right? Like don't give a kid a cell phone until grade 8. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, grade 8? We didn't even like cell phones barely existed in grade no, right? But like
Yeah, kids have them now as, early as grade 3, even if not earlier.
yeah, and I think that can be, and you mentioned at the very beginning about social anxiety or social difficulties, not being able to pick up on social cues and emotions and those types of things. And I think when you have that, and this isn't to tell anybody do or do not give your child a cell phone, but there's a responsibility that comes with a cell phone. There needs to be an understanding with that. And I think that's a totally different podcast than this one. But yeah, I think that's a big piece to it is understanding that there's a time and a place for technology, and it shouldn't just be I need my kid to leave me alone, so I'm going to put something on to distract them. I think I had somebody tell me it's like I was when I was before children I was really against just putting on a movie or putting on a show or something for my kid. Like I didn't want to do that. I was very adamant against it. And then I had a kid and I realized like I have to do this because I need that time. But it just kind of goes back like, well, what did your parents do when they wanted you to leave them alone? Right? They couldn't like a lot of parents today couldn't just be sent to go and play on an iPad or to do something like because they didn't exist. Right. And so looking back, like what did we do to get through this? And how can I maybe instill that in my child as well? So you mentioned boredom, you mentioned open-ended play. Like we had most of our toys were all building toys. So we had micros or at least enabled imagination, right? So we had micros, we had Duplo, we had Lego, we had, my sister had Barbies and all those types of things. But you could basically make towns, cities. They were different every time. You drove around. You made up your own scenarios. I know we've got blocks, and we've given blocks to other families who have children, just as a way to teach your kid how to just make things on their own, right?
Yeah, and I think there's so much to be said about open-ended materials and open-ended play. And I mean, that can be done indoors, that can be done outdoors. The outdoors naturally lends itself to open-ended play and creativity and imagination. And I think if you're to look at the materials and things that kids use when they're playing outside, they're using rocks, you're using sticks, you're using pine cones, and pretty much anything you can kind of get your hands on that moves. And you create, it's different every day, what you're creating and what you're playing. And that's the beauty of it, right? Is that it's just open and it can be whatever you want it to be. And the outdoors is just such a beautiful opportunity for that. And so I know a lot of educators, the school I work at and follow on Instagram and have kind of created a community with, our push is to bring the outdoors in. And so we bring in loose parts from outdoors and bring them into our classrooms so that kids can be building and creating with materials inside and outside. And there's that cross between the indoors and the outdoors. And there's something to be said about bringing the outdoors in the form of loose parts or open-ended materials, right? So you spoke to blocks being a really great way for kids to explore and create and build. And yeah, there's just so much freedom in having materials that aren't designed for one specific thing for play, right? Like you look at a little plastic, little tykes, those when I say this, we had it, the tool set, right? You have a little plastic hammer and your little screwdriver. And, if you have those in a classroom, chances are the kids are going to do the exact same thing with them every single day. They're going to hammer, they're going to pretend to screw things. And then that's it. That's what the play will be. Whereas if you bring in blocks or sticks or maybe some logs, one day those might be a hammer, one day they might be a screwdriver, but then the next day it might be a magic wand, or the next day it's, a cane to go for a hike over a mountain, right? So there's just so much freedom in allowing children to create what they want for when they need it.
Mm-hmm.
And having spaces in classrooms, having spaces in home, having spaces outside that provide materials to allow children to extend their play and to turn it into this imaginative, beautiful little micro world that they get to kind of create and change as they go. And then if they're playing with others, then you're adding in that whole social component of navigating with other people. And, I want this play to continue, and I want to keep doing this, this pirate game or whatever we're playing. If we're playing rough and tumble and they're, playing pirates or whatever, then, kids have to navigate those conflicts that arise that say, if you hurt me and I'm mad at you, if I act out in anger, then this play gets shut down because you're not going to want to play with me anymore. And if I, keep going, I talk to you about it, but then we can keep going and we're still going to play, then our play will continue and I get to keep playing the way I want to. So there's learning how to navigate some of those social situations in play, in outdoors, with all of these open-ended materials that you wouldn't necessarily get if everyone is fighting over that one little hammer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that is a good segue into what we will talk about in part 2. So let's actually just stop part 1 there, and we'll come back and we'll chat about that. State of the Industry Podcast.
I'll be back.